Good afternoon and welcome to the fifth and final webinar on This Lead is Killing Us web series hosted by the Martin and Gale Press Health Professions Division Library at Nova Southeastern University. A few housekeeping things before we begin. First, the session is being recorded and will be posted on our website, which I will share in just a moment. During the presentation, please make sure to remain muted. There will be time for questions. Feel free to enter your questions or post comments into the chat box as you think of them, and we'll get to as many as possible during the Q&A sessions. This web series is based on the National Library of Medicine digital exhibit, This Lead is Killing Us, a history of citizens fighting lead poisoning in their communities. Guest curated by Dr. Richard Mizell from the University of Houston. The exhibit explores how citizens have confronted lead industries, housing authorities, and elected officials to protect their health against the dangers of lead poisoning. The goal of this companion web series is to raise awareness about lead poisoning and empower our communities to advocate for healthier places to live, learn, and work. We have created a website with a link to the free online exhibit, which includes images, photographs, and documents for you to explore, as well as recordings of virtual events and resources. You can access the website by visiting lib.nova.edu/lead. In the virtual events page, you will find recordings of all the events from the web series. And in the resources page, you will find information on lead, lead poisoning, environmental health topics, and environmental justice. This afternoon, we're fortunate to have two presenters, NaTisha Hutson and Stacy Allsop. I will first introduce NaTisha, who will present, and then we will have a Q&A. Following that, I will introduce Stacy, who will then present and allow time for questions at the end. NaTisha Hutson is the founder and lead facilitator of Restorative Impact, a conflict resolution and restorative justice company that helps academic institutions, organizations, individuals, and families transform the way they approach, engage with, and resolve conflict. For nearly a decade, NaTisha has worked at the intersections of education, social justice, and conflict resolution, supporting K-12 schools, community colleges, universities, and nonprofit organizations. As a conflict resolution practitioner, NaTisha has served in the roles of mediator, ombudsman, conflict coach, and restorative justice facilitator. In the latter role, NaTisha worked as a direct services restorative justice practitioner and program manager, where she oversaw restorative justice implementation at 18 schools across 5 districts throughout the San Francisco Bay Area. Her professional experience in education includes equity-based program development, coordination and management, driving institutional diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, designing, implementing, and institutionalizing restorative justice practices. NaTisha holds a bachelor's degree in communication studies from Sacramento State University and a master's degree in conflict management and dispute resolution from Southern Methodist University in Dallas, Texas. Passionate about serving communities from a holistic approach, NaTisha is currently pursuing her second master's degree in clinical rehabilitation counseling at her alma mater, Sacramento State University. So now I will turn it over to NaTisha. Welcome and thank you for being here.
Thank you, Daisy. It is so good to be here with everyone. So excited about this series. I'm going to take a moment to share my screen. All righty. How does that look?
Looks great.
Okay. All right. I'm going to go ahead and get started. Daisy did a wonderful bio, so I can just skip right past that and get into the presentation. And just as a reminder, when I'm done, I am going to hold space for questions or comments before I transition into Stacy's portion of the presentation. So I'm going to start with talking a little bit about the indigenous roots of restorative justice, which is really important to include. We are then going to talk about the restorative justice lens a little bit, right? So what in doing restorative justice work and in championing restorative justice work, what framework should one have? Then I'm going to move into talking about systemic accountability and justice, and then ending with time for some questions. So a moment for some chat activity, if you all will oblige me. When you hear the term restorative justice, what comes to mind? Making things right, yes. Empowerment, restoring justice, community, making it whole, yes. And can you all hear me well? You can hear me well? Okay, perfect.
Yes.
Yes, feeling heard and respected, having hard conversations. Absolutely, all of those things. And something else typically comes up when I ask this question during presentations. It's schools, right? Or the incarceration system. So those two systems or institutions are really where restorative justice gets most of the recognition. But what we're talking about today is, what does restorative justice look like in response to community needs? And so I am going to show a video that will help frame our conversation, right? We're not talking about restorative justice with schools or one-on-one harm or the incarceration system. We're talking about something that is deeper on a systemic level. I'm gonna start this. Just let me know if you can hear it well.
A tragedy that should have never happened here in the United States of America. The denial of something as basic as clean, safe drinking water.
In April 2014, residents across Flint, Michigan turned on their faucets to find that the water had turned brown and was giving off a foul-smelling odor. Complaints began flooding the city's government offices, with fears of contaminated water growing as the days passed without improvement. The local government asserted that it was safe, despite the residents' concerns of contamination. Initial testing determined that Flint's water met all safety standards, and, despite increasing complaints from the city's residents, no action was taken. It wasn't until early 2015, almost a year after the initial reports of contaminated water, that the city was compelled by Leanne Walters, a Flint resident and mother of 4, to test the water for lead after her children broke out in rashes. The test would reveal dangerously high levels of lead in Flint's tap water. But how was Flint's water contaminated with lead in the first place? To trace the origins of Flint's water crisis, we have to follow the pipes. In the 1800s, lead was an attractive material for water pipes due to its malleability and durability. The health risks, however, were cause for concern, and by 1920, local governments limited or prohibited the use of lead pipes despite their efficiency benefits. Despite a congressional ban on their use in 1986, as many as 10 million lead pipes are still transporting water in American cities like Flint. The use of lead pipes in Flint, however, posed little threat to the community until 2014, when the city decided to switch Flint's water supply from the Detroit Water and Sewerage Department, or the DWSD, to the Carignan Water Authority, or KWA, in an effort to save a projected $200 million over 25 years. The wait to construct Flint's new pipeline connecting it to the KWA, however, would necessitate an interim water source, the Flint River. On April 25, 2014, Flint River water began flowing out of the city's faucets. Resident complaints about the water's color and odor came within a month. Flint's history, however, extends beyond just lead pipes. The city's population is 50% African American, the per capita income is less than half that of the rest of Michigan, and the poverty rate is 40.1%, the highest in the state. The demographics are essential in understanding the social and political effects of the water crisis, and may explain the decisions made by city and state authorities. The first response, of course, was to wait and see if any problems turned up. In April 2014, then Mayor Dane Walling cheered to Flint and drank water from the Flint River before cutting the city off from the DWSD, a public show of faith in the water's quality. It would be only days before complaints came in about the new water. In August, the water was found to contain elevated levels of E. coli and related bacteria, prompting the city to increase chlorine levels in the water. The water problems were made apparent in October when General Motors stopped using Flint water in its factories after discovering it was corroding metals. This allowed lead from the Flint pipes to contaminate the water supply. In February, tests found that Flint's water contained more than double the EPA's safety limit of lead. It was later found that the Flint treatment plant had not implemented anti-corrosion methods, violating the federal lead and copper rule. The consumption of water with such high lead levels poses great health risks. A study published by Dr. Mona NaTisha found that blood lead levels in children under 5 had increased from 2.4% to 4.9%, a statistically significant increase, which was most prevalent in socioeconomically disadvantaged neighborhoods. The city government initially told citizens to relax. Later in August, the MDEQ dropped 2 samples from its report on lead levels, putting the results within federal regulations despite very clear indications that the water was too dangerous to use. These cover-ups and inefficiencies demonstrate how uncaring the local government truly was. The system of emergency managers that governs Flint's reaction to public crises is structured to prevent accountability of officials and input of residents. This system is maintained by Governor Rick Snyder, who also appoints the emergency managers. The actions of Governor Snyder and the emergency managers like Darnell Early were deliberate and conscious. They knew that moving to the KWA and using the Flint River responsibly would be too large a financial project, choosing instead to forego the additional costs at the expense of the city's poor and minority populations. Thus, the Flint water crisis was also the result of structural and strategic racism. Today, the water in Flint is still unsafe. Though steps have been taken to reflect the magnitude of the crisis, such as the declaration of a federal state of emergency and the return to allegedly safe Detroit water, Flint residents are calling for accountability. Despite the tragedy of the situation, one thing is certain: the voices of Flint citizens will not be silenced.
Governor Snyder's address.
All right, so a video is never easy to watch, to see the conditions in which people are being forced to live and really being harmed, right, systemically by the government. And so before I move further into the presentation, I want to start on this slide, which is really important. So what you're looking at is an Adinkra symbol. And Adinkra symbols derive from the Akan tribe of Ghana. And this is a Sankofa bird. And the bird is looking back and it is fetching a seed to bring it forward. And what this symbolizes is it is not taboo to fetch what is at risk of being left behind. Restorative justice over the last 10 years has really taken off. Some would call it a buzz term. It has gained a lot of momentum and a lot of recognition, especially for the work that's being done with schools and the incarceration system. What is often left out of that narrative is the foundations from indigenous people who have set the groundwork for what we know as the restorative justice movement today. So I want to take some time to talk about that because this should inform all of our restorative justice work. And so an African concept, Ubuntu, I am because we are. This is how they approached being in community from this framework. I am because you are. That means that who I am as an individual, right, is not so much as important as who we are as a community, what I mean to the community, right? So that means that we are tied to one another. And it regards community as the building block for society. So our cultural norms, our ways of being with each other, the way we regard one another as community members, the way we come together and solve problems, that should be influencing society, not the other way around. We're so used to these punitive systems, and it's an individualistic way in which we tend to operate in the States, right? But culturally, there are nations who saw a need for something different, who really wanted to hone in on we are one as together, right? And that your humanity is bound inextricably to mine, which means if I dehumanize you, then I am also dehumanizing myself. And if society is dehumanizing communities, then we should all feel dehumanized. And it is all of our responsibility to fight against that and to make change. I also want to talk about the Indigenous Americans or Native Americans, right? And they believe that justice and spirituality are deeply connected, and they are both rooted in harmony and balance. And so when we talk about restorative justice and addressing harm and repairing harm and bringing people together. Native peacemaking circles are a great example of cultural foundations for those practices, right? Because again, we're trying to maintain harmony and balance amongst community, and justice is only achieved with regard to the community. So in the system that we have now, you can be a victim of a crime, you report it to a legal entity, and they kind of take it from there, right? And your voice is being lost. But perhaps what happened to you also impacted your family. Perhaps it impacted your neighbors or people who love and care about you outside of the home. What about them? So according to Native practice, and I love that, and it is also rooted in the restorative justice movement that we know today, you bring the community in, because once community feels whole, then justice has been achieved, right? Thinking about Ubuntu, because I am because we are, right? And so this is only a snippet because I don't have enough time to go into the indigenous roots and foundations, but I would be remiss to not make the connection between the restorative justice movement that we know today and the foundations of that from African and indigenous communities. And so I want to leave this section off with a quote by Kay Prentice, the author of the Little Book of Restorative Processes. The indigenous roots of restorative justice refer not just to the origins of the circle technique, but perhaps more importantly, the roots are in the worldview of indigenous people, the understanding of interconnectedness and the dignity of all parts of creation. So, restorative justice, what is it? People are often so confused. You hear about this term, but you don't really know what it is. And I'm not going to go into a formal definition. What I want to talk to you really about is the lens and the spirit of restorative justice work, because it encompasses many different practices. So restorative justice is proactive in fostering relationships and communities. And those are the indigenous roots that I just spoke of, right? It is not just a reactive approach. Something happened and now it's time for restorative justice. Restorative justice is ongoing. It is in the way we build and the way we build and sustain communities, right? So when we foster these relationships, when we put people at the forefront, that is restorative justice, right? On the proactive end. It is also a radical paradigm shift from what we are used to, in particular in Western culture. We're used to a retributive system, right? So what law was broken? What crime was committed? Who broke this rule, right? And then what is the punishment? What is the legal punishment? And these are all government sanctioned. We don't get to decide what a punishment looks like, right? When someone breaks a law or commits a crime against us, that's already predetermined for us. With restorative justice, it asks what harm was done and to whom? What needs have arisen as a result of those harms or the harm that was done? And then whose obligation is it to meet the needs of the persons harmed in a way that makes sure that the people who were harmed feel righted by it, right? It's totally different. It's not centering the law or the rule or the government system and how what you did brings consequences based on that system. It centers the person. It humanizes the experience of the person who was harmed. And language is really important in restorative justice. So it may seem like I'm saying the person who caused harm and the harmed person a lot. And that is because the victim offender model doesn't really fit with restorative justice, right? People do things, but they are not the totality of what they do. And because restorative justice does talk about, not on a system standpoint, right? But reintegrating people back into community and not throwing them away because they caused harm. We don't use victim, offender, or perpetrator, right? It's criminalizing language. Restorative justice is also a facilitated process. And this is really important to know. When I say facilitated, I am talking about, it takes a lot of work to prepare for a restorative justice process. Sometimes it's weeks, it could be months before people are ready to come together and have dialogue and start talking about the harm and the needs that have arisen and what needs to be done in order to make those things right. I know there's some conflict resolution people on the line, or even life coaching or things like that, right? It's really important to prepare for processes. So how are you talking to the people who are going to engage in the process about the process? Do they know what they're being asked to do? Do they know what it looks like to sit in a difficult conversation? And are they willing to do that? Restorative justice is not something that you just kind of read about and then you bring people together who have been harmed and caused harm, right? That is not fidelity to the process. And so I'm not speaking of formal education either. Yes, I have my master's in conflict management and dispute resolution. But as I spoke about, indigenous nations were doing this work before restorative justice was even a term. So it's not necessarily about, do you have formalized training? Do you have the paradigm and the lens needed in order to do this work? Do you understand it from a heart perspective? And do you own that responsibility? It also uplifts the voices of those harmed. So typically when you have situations, look at the video we just saw when we're talking about the lead crisis with lead poisoning. These are people who have traditionally and systemically been powered down, who have been pushed to the margins, right? And so again, as I said, something happens to you, there's harm, the legal system takes it from there, but your voice can easily be lost in all of that. And it happened to you. So restorative justice is about the people who were harmed, uplifting those voices and making sure that they are able to express themselves in a safe space, talk about their experience, talk about what they need, and hold others accountable. And there's also this misconception that restorative justice is people coming together and then they have conversation, and then at the end you hug it out and everybody feels warm and fuzzy, and then like it's done from there, right? And that is not restorative justice. It includes accountability. We are talking about what is happening in Flint and communities across this nation that are impacted by lead poisoning. People need to be accountable for that. And it's not just in a way that hears them, right, but takes ownership for the ways in which you are inflicting violence on communities, the way in which you are a catalyst for injustice against communities. And restorative justice also does not ask for or require apologies, forgiveness, or reconciliation. So Fania Davis talks about this, who is the author of the little book on race and restorative justice. She is also the founder of Restorative Justice Oakland Youth, very prominent figure in the restorative justice community. It doesn't require an apology. It doesn't require forgiveness. The point of restorative justice is not to bring people together and make them friends again, right? Or to kind of even out the playing field and start from scratch. It is about the people who are harmed feeling empowered by the process, feeling like they were heard, feeling like they expressed what their needs were. And if they feel that the process was conducive to that, then it is a successful process, but it is not contingent on forgiveness or reconciliation. When that happens, it is beautiful. I've had the honor and the privilege to facilitate processes where people were fighting, right? And at the end of the process, they came together. I'm not sure of any of you, but I have also seen restorative justice processes happen where victims of major crimes, right? They have spoken to those who committed the crime, and then they became close in relationship. There are even situations where people have committed crimes and the families, right? So it's a murder, maybe the families of the victim is championing that person to get out for parole or to be released from the prison system, because through the restorative process, they came to an understanding with one another. And it's beautiful when that happens. But it does not take away from someone who does not want to apologize or extend forgiveness in a process. When we're talking about these communities that have been systemically harmed, if they are not ready to fully trust their local government or lock arms and say everything is okay now, that is okay. And that doesn't mean that restorative justice did not happen. There are three major pillars of the restorative justice collaborative dialogical process. Again, this is from Mrs. Vanya Davis, right? And all restorative justice processes have these components: storytelling and relationship building. Right? It is dialogue based. So we are talking about ourselves, not just what happens, but who am I? How long have I been in this community that is now being victimized, right? And being poisoned legally through poor water quality or building constructs, right? What does it mean for me to live here? I've been here 20 years. I've raised my family here. You know, this community means a lot to me. These are the types of conversations we have in restorative processes, right? We are humanizing people, and we are also truth telling, right? And holding people accountable. Restorative processes are not easy. A lot of people think, oh, you just come in and talk. It's a very difficult thing to take accountability, and it is a very difficult thing to hear people who have been harmed talk about how your actions have impacted them and their family, right? That has to take place in all restorative processes. And also reparative action. So we move beyond talking about what happened, how we feel, and what we need, but the person who caused the harm has to repair that harm some sort of way. So you have to pay attention to what people are saying and what they need. And then there needs to be an intention to make things right and to act on that. So how do we hold systems accountable using restorative justice? This is not some answer I can just rattle off to you, right? All situations look different and require different things. But what I can talk to you about is how we approach the process of restoring justice, right? And I go back to those questions because this is really foundational to the lens of restorative justice. We have to understand what harm was done and to whom, right? Who are we talking about and what are we talking about? And what needs have arisen from the harm that was done? People need to feel safe. Children die from lead poisoning, right? People get sick, right? It is cancerous, it is an inconvenience. Not everyone has a financial means, right, to go buy packages of water, right? Cases is the word I'm looking for. Cases of water to brush their teeth in, to bathe in for them or their entire families. It creates burden, it creates inconvenience, and it jeopardizes folks' health, right? So what about those needs? And then whose obligation is it to meet the needs of those harmed? And how will those needs be met in a way that honors the community that was harmed and makes them feel righted? Right? I am because we are. I have made this right because you feel righted by what I have done. And there has to be agreement and alignment around that. Restorative justice, yes, is about repairing harm and addressing harm, right? And in many cases, it is an individual event. Something happens to an individual, but it absolutely encompasses transformative justice, especially when we are talking about systemic oppression, environmental racism, right? And what is happening to these communities. The system has to change in order for things to be restored, right? Something has to transform so that the perpetuation of the harm does not continue. There's a lot of controversy. I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with that around the term restorative justice, because when you talk about Black communities, when you talk about low income earning communities, folks will say, what are we restoring justice to? We've never had justice in this country. We've never saw justice in this country. We have always been dehumanized. We have always been systemically silenced and pushed to the margins and ignored. So what are we restoring to? That is the importance of understanding the foundations, the indigenous roots, right? the African principles and practices, the native principles and practices around this work, because what we are trying to restore is a sense of community that cares about one another. We are trying to restore the practices of seeing the humanity in you and understanding that the humanity in you is tied to the humanity in me. We're getting back to, we have to resolve issues, right? Because harmony and balance are important. As the natives would tell us, the Native Americans tell us, harmony and balance, harmony and balance. And so if there's harm, if there's conflict, there is no harmony, right? And we are imbalanced. So how do we do that? So it's not just a singular process of restorative justice for these communities. Okay, we fix the water, say that we fix the water, they have a clean water supply today. But what about the trauma? What about the distrust? What about the racism? What about the oppression of communities who are, low socioeconomically earning? What about that? Right? We have to take care of those issues as well. So when you think of restorative justice, also think about transformative justice, because we do have to advocate for things to change so that harm can be stopped, not just for the moment, but permanently. And it is also important to understand that when you do restorative processes, restorative justice, the answers come from those harmed. So even though I might facilitate a restorative justice process, I'm not the expert. I don't know what people need, and it's not for me to impose what I think is needed on to them. As facilitators, you ask the right questions and you listen to understand in the process. What happens is people who are traditionally oppressed, who are silenced, who are pushed to the margins, sometimes they are not used to being asked questions about what they need, how they feel. And so sometimes it can take a little time, but that doesn't mean that you jump in and hijack the process and tell them what they need. Questions are really powerful, right? And I know my conflict resolution folks on the line, right, understand this. And I believe there's a life coach on the line as well, understanding that there's a lot of power in asking the right questions because people know what they need. It's not for us to do that for them. And there also has to be a commitment to correcting the harm done through current and future actionable steps. And that is what I was speaking of about the reparative action. And there must be follow up and also follow through. So you say that you are going to do this, governor, or these emergency crisis managers, right, who are responsible for taking care of these communities. They have a legal obligation in addition to an ethical and moral obligation. So who's making sure that you are following up on what you say you are going to do to right the harm that has happened to this community? What are the benchmarks? Is this an ongoing process? If so, are communities who are impacted at the table? Are they included in these meetings that might happen or these plans that might happen in terms of how we are going to address the situation and make it right? The follow-up and follow-through is so important. And again, that is why when restorative justice processes takes place, it is important that you understand the work, the paradigm by which we do this work, because you understand that a part of restorative justice is also advocacy and activism. So we push people to do the right thing. And if they are a part of the restorative justice process, right, they're signing up for that. And that's that prep work. They have an understanding that they are going to be held accountable and that there is an expectation that they do commit to their word and that they do honor the needs of those they have harmed. In closing, right, I just want to re-emphasize some key points that I mentioned in our conversation today, and that is that restorative justice is social justice work. And it is inspired by African and indigenous American ideologies and practices. It is social justice work. If you are a proponent of restorative justice, you cannot turn a blind eye to oppression, to racism, to classism, right? To all of these things that impact communities. They go hand in hand. And if you are to be authentic and credible as a restorative justice practitioner, then you have to know and understand that it does require preparation and facilitation. It is a process to be taken seriously. People's lives are at stake, and you don't just arbitrarily enter into a process of restoring justice to a community without being thoughtful, without being intentional, without being deliberate. Restorative justice also honors and uplifts the voices of those harmed. It creates space for both those harmed and those who have caused harm, the opportunity to speak, listen to, and connect with one another. Being in that space, it is powerful and it can be transformative. It's easy to inflict harm on people that you don't necessarily have to see. I don't live in this neighborhood. These aren't my people. This is not my community. I can do this and sleep like a baby at night. But when people are in front of you and you see how you have impacted these people's lives, the harm you're causing, the danger you are putting them in, it becomes different if you have a soul. And also, when dealing with systemic harm, restorative justice must always include transformative justice, right? I am because you are. And because you are, therefore I am. Restorative justice is about community. And it is about doing the right thing and honoring the needs of those in which we are in community with, and understanding how our actions impact them. So I thank you for your time. And if anyone has some questions of me before we transition to Stacy's portion, which she's going to dig a little more into the research side and what has been done, how restorative justice has been a catalyst for bringing about environmental justice to communities. You can go ahead, and I think, Daisy, are they going to be read from the chat, or how are you going to handle
We can do both. If you have any questions, you can enter them into the chat and we can read them off from there, or please feel free to unmute yourself and ask the question live. Thank you so much, NaTisha.
You're welcome.
It was great. Yeah, wonderful. For providing that lens. Yeah.
Thank you.
Kudos in the chat.
Yes, thank you all. And so if you don't have any questions, that is okay. And they will also have information for people who would like to follow up with me, or if you want to contact me in any way, if something comes to your mind, feel free.
This is Alicia. I have a question.
Okay.
I'm sorry, y'all, I'm driving, so that's why my camera's off. So, Tisha, when you talk about the accountability, are you talking about wanting to uncover systemic racism? What is that process like? Like, do you, when you're in, I know in my role, I am having these informal conversations about what does accountability look like. But when I am trying to make recommendations to like the chief diversity officer about, some harm and they're, wanting to come back, how do you guide this process for that piece?
Okay, Alicia, and I think I heard you, but you broke up a little bit, at least on my end. But what I heard you say is, what does it look like when we talk about restoring justice from a systemic level, right? When we're talking maybe to administrators or folks who are the gatekeepers or the decision makers about that. How do we approach that? I think what is most important is making sure they understand how people feel is the first part, right? Because sometimes you can, and I work with universities and school systems, and it is really hard. And so there's like this surface level of, I understand that there's a problem with this, but I don't think they really understand like the impact of it. What I have done is done circles with administrators and students in my case, of which the administrators sit on the outside of the circle. And on the inside of the circle, it's called a fishbowl, and students would come on the inside, right, and really share their stories and talk about how they are impacted. I think we also have to make sure that when we're talking about systems, that we are connecting those that they are directly impacting to them. So sometimes we have these meetings and we have the privilege of being at the table, but the folks that we are maybe advocating for are not at the table. So thinking about ways that we can bring them into that process. And then when we're talking about system, there are policies, there are procedures, right? There are these statements around equity and diversity and what we stand for. And it is imperative to bring that back to their attention when need be and hold them to that. This is what we are responsible for, right? You're supposed to be protecting communities. This is the way we serve communities here at this institution or organization, right? And so if people are feeling this way, what is that disconnect? And then going through those tangible steps with them, right? What is your plan? How do you plan to not only address this in the now, but what does the ongoing addressing look like? And how can folks tell, right, that we are transforming this system? How can they see that? And so making sure that there are real tangible steps that resonate outside of that office, that people can really feel on the ground is really important. I hope that answered your question. Let me see it.
Thank you, NaTisha and Alicia, for your question. I wanted to check in. I saw Colina had her hand up. Colina, did you have a question?
I did, but Alicia's question was so close to mine and NaTisha answered it, so I'm good. Thank you.
Okay,
Thank
great.
you.
And then we have Mazen. Do you want to unmute yourself to ask your question?
Hey, thank you so much and great presentation. There was one thing I wanted to add to, and it's more like a comment. I think one of the hardest things for restorative justice is the identification of the issue, and to the system, it's not that the system perceives it as a threat. I think that's usually the biggest mistake. You know, well, not that it's a mistake, just that it gets turned on its head. In that rather than it becoming something to identify and try to understand, the structure or the system takes that as a threat to the system or the structure and kind of shuts it down. Mm-hmm. I think you know, we live in a world full of norms, and sometimes, you know, we don't understand how you know, us taking superiority or something like that can be an injustice to somebody else. So I think that's where, you know, being compassionate about you know, listening is also important for restorative justice. But great presentation and really great points. Just wanted to say thank you and add that comment.
Thank you. Mazen, was it?
Yeah.
Mazen, thank you so much for that. And you're absolutely right. And that is where being a restorative justice facilitator, it's not it's not for the faint of heart at all. And so when you're doing prep work or people bring you in as a consultant, you have to have hard conversations. And sometimes you have to talk to them in the language they understand, which is data, right? So you look at the data, and maybe we're doing a culture and climate evaluation if we're talking about, you know, organizations or systems. How are people feeling? Right? And then you make it plain. Okay, well, these are the results. These are the numbers, right? So we can't deny that. Sometimes you have to do that in order to make people understand this is really a problem. Or when you're talking about, you know, communities, bringing them together, involving media, right? Those types of pressure, because it is about now, how am I looking, right? What is the reputation? And that can sometimes get, that can sometimes get the attention of the folks that we need to. A lot of organizations, a lot of government systems, they do have committees. And equity work is typically a part of what they are supposed to do. So how are we speaking them from an equity-based lens, a justice-based lens, and getting them to understand that what you're doing is actually contrary to that? And then it is also important to find allies in these systems, So maybe the person at the top is not on board, but there are other folks within these institutions, these organizations, in these communities that do have influence, that do feel the way you feel. So how do we link up? How do we start forming maybe advisory boards? And then how is that advisory board? Do we come up with a list, a list of demands, or how are we requesting meetings, and how are we getting on the same page, right? A multi-pronged approach to putting this problem in the faces of those who need to see it, but then also working with them, letting them know that we're not just accusing you and abandoning you. No, we are here to hold you accountable. And it is not just in a way where we're pointing the finger at you and making you feel bad. We're telling you what you need to hear in order to right this situation. And we're going to do it with you. And that is where we have to do that internal work, right? And we have to understand that sometimes we do have to align ourselves with those who have caused harm in order to bring them where they need to be, in order to transform the ways in which they are perpetuating this harm. I hope that made sense. But thank you so much for that comment, Mason.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for yours. Actually, that was really enlightening. And I tip my hat to you. I really do. And thank you so much.
Thank you.
Wonderful. We have one more question in the chat from Emerald. Can you talk more about how accountability might look in organizations when in restorative work?
Yeah. Was there a specific organization? I know I've said a lot, so I don't want to be redundant, but is there something maybe more specific that I can offer, Emerald?
No, I think you answered a lot. I put the question before you started your last answer. I think you've shed a lot of light on that, but I was generally, wondering about, what are some like signposts for us? So if we are really trying to get to a place of restoration within organizations, and let's say it's education, right? That's the field that I'm in. How would accountability look? I see lots of posts or statements coming out from organizations saying that they support communities of color, they support, engaging in anti-racist work. And then when you look at the things that continue to happen in those organizations, it's like, well, are you really doing those things? Mm-hmm. And how do we know that you're at a place of correcting or restoring those folks who have been harmed within your organization and continue to be harmed after you've made declarations of support for them? So I'm wondering if you might have examples that you could share that are specific, like this organization did this one thing, and that was, a restorative or a reparative activity.
Yeah, thank you for that. So I will share that there was an organization that I worked with in the past that was doing restorative justice work, but the people inside felt harmed and victimized by the organization that was doing restorative justice work. There were issues around racism. There were issues around being paid unfairly. There were all of these things, right? And these are the people who are carrying out restorative justice work, yet internally, people are feeling like, and people were really harmed by what was happening. And I think what happens is there has to be some sort of evaluation, right? Where are we right now? And it has to be an intentional, like stopping. And education, right, has a really hard time with that. Just stopping and assessing where we are in the moment, right? And then those questions, what harm is happening? Who is being harmed? And what are the needs of those harmed? Are we figuring out that answer for them, or are we incorporating their literal voices in this conversation, right? And so then when you have folks at the table who are being harmed and you continue to meet with them and you create benchmarks with them, right? And they are responsible for making sure that what you say you're going to do is being done, then you get a real pulse on community and understand, okay, we are changing, because that's how you know there should be transformation. As long as things are staying the same, then there has not been any restoration happening. So people will tell you, again, that's why it's important to incorporate those voices. They will tell you how they feel. And if you survey enough people and you do that on a continual basis, those numbers should change. Those ratings should change. The narratives of their experiences should be changing. And if they are not, then you are not doing work. I will say that organizational change typically takes 3 to 5 years. It's a long haul. It's a long haul. And so a part of it is also helping organizations and institutions understand that you can't sign up for something for 6 months to a year and want to see these drastic results. That's not, it's not an effective way to transform systems. It took a long time to get here, and it's going to take a long time to start undoing and unlearning those harmful practices. Another way we know is what resources are being designated. Are you putting your money where your mouth is? This is really important, right? But we need financial resources to do this. We need human resources to do this, and we need time. If you're not dedicating finances, time, and human resources, then more than likely change is not occurring. So I think those are three important areas that we can use to hold systems accountable. Financially, how are you going to be accountable for changing this? How are you going to give folks the time and bring people in, right? Or designate people to make sure that what you say we stand on, to make sure that the ways in which we say we are going to repair harm is actually being done. And that should be an ongoing process. Are you dedicating the 3 to 5 years that it takes? It's not going to happen in an academic year, certainly not going to happen in a semester. And also, what are the conditions, right, in which people are doing this work in? Because if people are burnt out, if they're feeling unsupported, right, then the change that they are tasked with making sure happens can't happen. So it really is a holistic thing. And those advisory committees, or getting task forces together of people who understand the work, and giving them the time and resources to make sure that it's mapped out correctly and that they have what they need in order to make sure the work gets done is really important. It's critical. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, NaTisha. We really appreciate your expertise and in answering our questions and comments. So we're going to move to Stacy's portion, connecting the the research into lead poisoning and environmental justice. And it's really nice to have NaTisha's lens of restorative justice, to help us understand how to advocate for better living conditions, whether it's lead poisoning or any other environmental threats. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce Stacy. Let me just share my screen here. All right, so we're also excited to welcome our next speaker, Stacy Allsop. Stacy's a reference and instruction librarian at Nova Southeastern University's Alvin Sherman Library and the liaison to the Helmuth College of Arts and Sciences, Department of Conflict Resolution Studies, and to the College of Computing and Engineering. Stacy was awarded a Master of Library Science and a Master of Information Sciences from Indiana University Bloomington in 2003. She has worked at NSU for 17 years and is interested in a wide array of topics that impact the existence and well-being of living things and the design of communities. Stacy looks for intersections and interdisciplinary approaches to teaching information literacy and knowledge management, helping people understand how sustainability, innovation, scholarly communication, and informatics impacts their lives and goals. So now I will turn it over to Stacy. And thank you for being here and helping us coordinate this whole session.
I was muted, now I am not muted. Everybody makes that mistake. Okay, I did want to pop into the chat one of the links that's handy to kind of look at, with the idea of that when we're looking at issues like this, they're generational. Lead sticks around. So we should be looking for interaction with diversity of peoples, right? But the young generations, as they come up, are starting to work on things. So media and outlets and contests and opportunities are always good things to start looking for when you're starting to look at a project like this, where they're not always talking about restorative justice. They're using other phrasing, which is what we'll talk about today. However, this particular link was a group of students that came together. They did a podcast. They won an award through NPR series. And, you know, if you go into the story, if you listen to the podcast, you can hear them really start to understand communities are different. Even within, they were talking within Brooklyn. Brooklyn is just not Brooklyn. Brooklyn is a system that's composed of lots of pieces, right? And populations don't stay the same, things rotate. You have people that move into neighborhoods. Knowledge of lead poisoning and environmental justice has changed over time. And so these are really crucial factors in understanding this. In my presentation today, we're going to be talking about how to really think about it, because you can't just go into the database and type in restorative justice and lead poisoning and then get a ton of articles. It doesn't work that way, because this is fairly new on how we're viewing it through this lens. Environmental justice, social justice has been around for a long time, but people are just starting to learn about all the different types of justices, right? And the ways that you work with people. Okay, so let me open up my PowerPoint. And there we go. So it was my great pleasure to be able to connect with NaTisha and help get this particular workshop launched. If anybody has any questions, we're gonna take those at the end. But I have my information on LinkedIn. You can also contact me through my email, which I'll have at the end. Okay, so one of the biggest things with this is there's absolutely no time to cover everything that we would need to talk about in order to how to find research and resources on this area. And I truly believe that, you know, every person I talk to, I learn from, and I hope that they can learn something from me. So you should see your librarians, no matter where you live or where you are virtually, as a resource. You can always, for instance, make appointments with us. You can ask us about what resources exist. And most libraries offer appointments. We do a lot of Zoom appointments right now. But that kind of engagement is really important to us, and hopefully you reach out to us as a resource. The other thing is the call to action. As more and more people put forth these initiatives, they may not call them restorative justice. Obviously, they are, you might be working through citizen science. You might be using a special toolkit to find out what your personal impact is, how maybe your neighbor is being impacted. And that's that care for humanity that's important. That's why these initiatives exist. Citizen science has a crowd the tap, where you were trying to figure out what's actually coming out of your tap water. EPA has one that is a quick check too, and it also has an outreach campaign so that you can talk to other people in your community. There's volunteer options where you can engage with the topic and keep pushing it out, because Flint is still having problems. You know, it is going to be a long-term thing. And anytime I talk to somebody about lead poisoning, they're like, oh, Flint. I was like, yeah, but Flint's not the only community that's being affected. And it's not just water, it's also issues with industry and issues with aging housing systems. And then it's everywhere at this point. When you're framing the ideas of restorative justice with environmental justice, it's good to look internationally. You're going to find a lot of stuff coming out of Australia, Europe, Africa. It's not just based in the United States. They also use a lot of phrasing interchangeably. So like just this one document referred to it as restorative environmental justice, and then they also referred to it as environmental restorative justice. They're trying to bridge these ideas together and build a model for how people really think about this concept. The other really crucial part of this is leadership. You hear us talk about leaders, policies, you know, the engagement with the communities telling leadership, this is a problem in our community, the leadership saying, no, it's not. So part of our job is to understand what leadership is in place. This is coming from a book that we actually have in the library, talking about you can't just think of leadership as these little niche areas anymore. You really have to look at transcending these topics. The idea of a community being resilient is also nature being resilient. All these things are coming together at one point in a convergence. We have climate change, we have sustainability issues, we have pollution going on in our communities. And it's not just restoring the Flint community, it's looking at the environment, the structure, the buildings, the everything that is that community. If we look at the journal Environmental Research, they refer to the urban lead burden. And this is an article where I actually found they actually pulled together everything into a systemic talk, right? Lead's effect on humans, animals, and the natural environment. They're not necessarily talking about restorative justice and how to fix it, but they're saying that it's all connected. And that we should be starting to think about these pockets of really high toxicity as repositories, not good repositories, toxic repositories. Because once it's in, you know, the soil, the buildings, it's in your schools, it's also in the natural environment, the trees may be holding on to it. They started to do studies that said, you know, how are the animals reacting? And they've studied pigeons, other types of birds, deer, etc. And they're finding that the animals are just as affected as the humans are. But it's also causing some other neurological things like increased aggressiveness, mental illness, attention deficit disorder. There's a lot of effects across the system. And just very quickly, toxicologies can be considered interdisciplinary. There is a journal that represents that. They have a couple articles out there that kind of give a good introduction of how lead has existed from early history to now, what it actually impacts. Some of this particular article, the figures are really good because it shows you exactly what the impact is. There was another one that talked about, the toxic effects of metals, not just thinking about lead, but thinking about things like mercury, cadmium, all these other heavy metals. And it's really important to frame the idea with understanding that metals have these molecular things that are going on that are affecting us. So I have a note here that's talking about a caution, I cannot pronounce that word, apologies. But it's affecting us and our systems on so many levels at this point. And this is why when you research it, you have to think about it from really different perspectives. Reviews on environmental health had a good article in 2009 talking about really understanding the effect of these ions that I mentioned, the fact that this metal is now in our system, that is not just affecting us, you know, on maybe an everyday level, where it's getting into our genetic structure. And so now there's actually biomarkers, and they're using those to monitor lead exposure. The problem comes with the fact that since lead is kind of able to move through our body, it can be hard to figure out where the lead is coming from. So you see a lot of studies talking about, oh, it's in the kids' teeth, it's in their bones. But it can actually move throughout the body. And a lot of times you see a lot of articles talking about the effect on children, but it's affecting every age level that is in the system that is toxic. So where would you search to find information about this, particularly the intersections between the different types of justices and pollution, lead poisoning, those types of environmental issues? You really have to search across everything. There are a lot of great projects that are in place with communities, volunteer organizations, outreach, advocacy, activism, that maybe the more published research or the things that are more academic are not talking about. There's not enough scientists that are actually pushing that content out. So you're not just jumping into a library database and searching, you are going in, you know, and searching through the government agencies, USA.gov, some of the European collections, Australia, Africa. You're searching across news and media, you're going into maybe some more specialized collections. And then there is a lot of open access publishing for those of you who need that. You need some of that immediate access. And it's important for scientists to be able to push that information out. The publishers don't always offer open access that is cheap for the person that's writing and publishing. So there's a lot of whole issues about the paywall, but that's the other reason why you want to reach out to your librarians, because even as an alumni, the search process would be different for the library collection, but you still have access to it. As a public person, you still have access to things. It's just being able to access the resources from different perspectives and understanding how to collect the information. So you're going to want to look for intersections, holistic approaches to the topic, different types of crossing into different disciplines. Sometimes it's referred to as cross, inter, or multidisciplinary. Translational is a word that comes out of the more of the medical realm, but really you can apply it to a lot of different concepts now. The idea that you would come together as a multidisciplinary team for patient care, for looking at what does justice mean in a community. You're going to find things that are coming out of conflict resolution, mediation, criminal justice, law, all the core disciplines, all the major subjects. And yes, the history is part of that because lead has been around for a very long time. And our understanding of it has changed over time. So you may find articles that are like, okay, well, this is how lead was used in the past. And it gives you ideas about maybe how to think about it, what it means now. So there are a lot of different ways to come into the topic and find the information. So here's some examples of how things intersect. You have your conflict studies lens, you have things like restorative justice, but they may talk about it as environmental restorative justice. They may call it environmental reparation. You'll see things on environmental justice, or conversely, environmental injustice or ecological injustice. EPA, CDC, they all have major sites connecting to environmental justice and what that means. Environmental crime is a huge one that's come up, along with environmental politics or environmental harm, environmental health, things that have to do with degradation, because the idea that, like, for instance, the paint on the buildings, as it degrades, releases lead dust into the environment. So they may be talking about environmental degradation of a piping system for water, and they may not necessarily use some of these other terms. Green criminology is a huge area. It's probably a little bit less talked about in the United States. You're starting to see more and more articles about it, though, and it's a big part of this topic, as is things that have to do with public health and promotion, and the ideas of disparities and equities in the system, particularly things like environmental racism. A couple of publication examples that are actually more directly tying the two areas together. So 2013, Sustainability and Intergenerational Equity. It's in the journal Sustainability Science, which I actually found quite a lot in that journal. It's talking about intra and intra-generational equity when it comes to things like lead poisoning. It's a key read. It's maybe a step back from saying, this is how we fix it. It's saying this is how we should think about it in terms of long-term pollution, long-term impacts on communities, long-term impacts on people, their families, and the neighborhoods that continue generation after generation. And if you think about restorative justice, it's not something normally that happens like instantaneously, like something happens and then, okay, we're going to put something in place. A lot of the discussions about restorative justice have come out for issues that have been around for a while. The 2018 article in the Environment Journal, Science and Policy for Sustainable Development, is actually a commentary on somebody else's article, The Paradox of Water in the Flint Crisis. The original article didn't use the phrase restorative justice. It talked about a lot of communities that needed environmental justice, but it was the commentary that actually talked about restorative justice. So you have to keep an eye out for the pieces that are talking about other scientists' ideas, right? So somebody else is interpreting or analyzing a piece. 2019 Health, Education, and Behavior Journal published a really key article, a collaborative approach to assess legacy pollution in communities near a lead acid battery smelter. And the smelting, the battery recycling, the industrial plants, these have been around in communities for a while. This one specifically is like, what can we do to have like a university or an organizational entity work with the people in the community to figure out what can happen? And this is a great piece to read to really get an insight of something more specific to restorative justice and environmental issues. 2021, Environmental Science and Policy Journal. They're talking about a data-driven method for finding environmental justice communities in New York. New York has come up a lot with their water quality and other environmental issues. So it's not just, oh, we know which communities need the help. It's we need to identify the communities that are being the most impacted. We need to identify the people that are willing to work on this. We need to identify the people who, you know, will talk with us, or we can go to them and talk to them and ask if they want to be involved. So there's a lot of information coming out about GIS, data, finding the people, finding the areas where more science, more communication needs to take place. In terms of your search strategies, these are words that I start out with. Looks like a word salad, right? You have a lot of stuff going on here. I had to be extremely careful with exact phrasing because of how people put their phrasing in their words. People talk about it in lots of different ways. You don't always have them say the phrase lead poisoning, for instance, right? So we pick out words that are connecting to that idea of pollution or poisons or toxins. You're putting in heavy metal or lead, depending on how specific you want to be. You have to be careful with the word lead because it also comes up with lead. So if you don't put the right terms in connection to it, you can get all sorts of stuff. Maybe adding in environment or ecology can be helpful. There are some other similar ideas of like greenwashing that comes from corporations, epidemiology, from medicine. Usually justice, injustice, maybe some words of equity or inequity, and some concepts that have to do with conflict resolution. These intersections are going to allow us to help find the research. And then in terms of anything you're doing, remember to work with your librarians or work with other experts on developing a good search plan and keeping track of it, because you never know where research like this is going to go. Maybe you did it for a class project, maybe you're interested in it personally, maybe you want to do something with your community. So keep track of what's working and what isn't working, and then talk to somebody to improve that process for finding things. I suggest a citation manager. There's free ones out there. If you're a NOVA person, you have access to EndNote. And we have librarians on staff that can help you figure out how to actually use it. I also do something called berry picking, which is finding out who is talking about each other. So maybe you're talking about somebody's been cited a lot. Well, who has referred to them in their lit review? Who are the authors talking about? What are the major periodicals that keep coming up over and over and over again? Maybe just going directly to that journal might help me search within. And then terminology. Scientists and authors are always coming up with new ways of saying things. So it's good to keep track of that kind of stuff when it pops up. That's how I came up with some of my terminology. I was like, oh, I had not necessarily thought about it this way. Okay, I'll put it in my notepad. In terms of library resources, you want to search library catalogs for books. There's usually quite a lot of ebooks in most libraries. WorldCat is a catalog system that allows you to search across multiple catalogs, multiple libraries. NOVA has something called Policy Map. There's going to be a workshop on Policy Map coming up soon in NOVA and in this month, actually, as part of our GIS series and Geography Awareness Week. But there's also a free version of Policy Map if you don't have access to it directly. ProQuest Natural Sciences collection has quite a lot of information in it. as does Green File, which is an environmental awareness database. And then, of course, the medical literature like CINAHL, Medline, PubMed. You'll find some content in PsycInfo when you're trying to get the intersection of the justice and the impact to the community. And then Project Muse is a collection of university publications, university small presses, and JSTOR is a multidisciplinary collection, as is Web of Science. And there are some other Clarivate products too that index things like data sets and other types of specialized materials. But this is not the list to end all list. It's actually the information spread across a lot of areas of interest, a lot of resources. So it's not, like I said at the beginning, it's not just, hey, I'm looking for lead poisoning and restorative justice, and I'm going to pop it into my search box and all these articles are going to magically appear. This is a forefront. This is a unique intersection. So really reach out to the experts, the community leaders, the librarians that can help you search for this type of information. Whether you're trying to maybe figure out what projects are going on in your community, or maybe somebody that's published about it, or maybe as a student or a faculty staff person, you want to write about it and you're saying, hey, is my idea unique? Did I find a gap? We can help you with that too. So here's my email. If anybody has any questions that they didn't want to ask live, feel free to reach out to me. We're also looking for presenters for upcoming workshops. So that's the other thing you can reach out to me about. And there is a guide up for our Geography Awareness Week series and our GIS Day that's coming up very, very soon. And I would be the contact person for that series as well. So any questions? I will stop my sharing. We do have a survey if anybody wants to give feedback on my part of the presentation, or any information you want to give us, that would be awesome.
Thank you, Stacy. That was great. You know, a lot of good tidbits about doing research on this topic. And also I like the fact that, you know, not everything's going to say restorative justice, but it could definitely be related to. They just may not use that phrase, you know, but if they're talking about community healing and working together and a lot of things that NaTisha talked about, then that would be, you know, that would meet your needs. So.
Yeah, because, you know, honestly, I don't know how many people know the concept restorative justice at this point. I meet people that are like, what's that? You know?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm sure as a strategic researcher, writer, you know, person, you may not want to use restorative justice when you think that the phrase environmental justice or environmental racism fits what you're trying to reach out to the audience.
Right. Any questions? Please feel free to unmute yourself. You can use the chat too. You can reach out to Stacy directly as well. Damaris commented, it's an awesome idea on storing the words. So I'm assuming the search words, the keywords, which is a good idea. So
it can be something super simple. It can be something like a Word document. But I also know people that use concept mapping or journaling. Most of the databases allow you to download and store lists of what you've done previously. You can even make a personal database account and save your favorite stuff so you can get back to it.
Yep. Good comments on the chat. Nice presentation. You gave so many great resources. And Kalina, Stacy's a great resource when doing any type of research. That's awesome.
Thank you so much.
So we do have a question from Brandon. What is an effective way balancing the issues that come with using words that have multiple meanings like lead, heavy metal, etc.?
Balancing the issues. What do we mean by balancing the issues?
I think he means that, like, for example, lead could also mean, could be the metal, but it could also be like leading or lead, like leadership. And then heavy metal, could be.
Oh, yes, of course. So here's the thing, it's context, right? So when you're putting your words into a search engine or a database, it's the words that you put in there that make the difference. If you're doing a Google search, you're not just necessarily just sticking the words in there. You might want to do advanced search where you can tell Google what you're looking for. Google's not psychic, just like most of our databases aren't, right? Not yet. Maybe in the future. But so it's the context of what words you're putting in. So if we did a ProQuest search in our natural sciences collection, my first box would be things like lead. And then if I wanted to add in like the heavy metal, if I wanted it to be broader, but usually it would be lead. And then the second box would be things like poison, toxin, any synonym. Right? And I put or between the words, depending on what the database wants me to do. But basically I'm saying these are all the synonyms. And then my third box is something like environmental, ecology. I might even have a fourth line where I put in justice and those types of things. Then I'm letting the database show me things. Now, every once in a while with that search, you get something really funky, like somebody's last name was Justice and they wrote an article about leading an environmental movement. I found one of those this morning when I was doing that search. I was like, oh, that's funny. Where did the justice part come up? Oh, it was his last name. Okay. But generally, most of the results are going to be focused in. They're going to be, okay, the database is like, I'm not going to show you all the business stuff is because you put in the word justice and environmental, and I have context for what I'm trying to show you. So it's all about context and how you're putting your words into the search engine and kind of knowing how that search engine works, which is where your librarians and your experts come into play, because we can tell you, oh, this one that works this way, or this one's not very good with this, so try this. I'm in these collections every single day for a lot of different projects, my own projects, work, etc. So we're in them all the time, figuring out how they work so that we can teach other people how they work. And that in itself is a superpower. Like, I am trying to give people the superpower ability to find information. I used to teach people like that were really cautious about using search engines. I said, just look at Best Buy's search engine and see if we can find a TV. And you put in television and it has a bunch of filters, like what size you want or what company. Databases work the same way. They give you special features, and then they have extra things in there, like what is the methodology of the article? Is it scientific or not? Is it scholarly? And there's there's special features like standardized language, like what's the language of the field, so like in the beginning when I was searching for topics like this, I was like, oh, I hadn't even thought about epidemiology, but that's coming out of health sciences, and now it's one of my search words all the time, because I know I'm going to find more literature that's coming from the public health side that's looking at the structural system of lead poisoning in communities when I add in epidemiology. Now, albeit, I usually have a cheat sheet, and I would recommend that for anybody working on a project like this, where you're looking at these intersections, where you have the word and you kind of define it. And then you might have also the note to yourself, like, this is what it means to me, non-jargon. Why am I using this word? Note to self. I do a lot of note to self kind of stuff. because you have the more scientific understanding of the word and terminology, and then you have how you are understanding it and what it means to your project. And I recommend doing that for almost anything. Even searching for TVs, because there's language in Best Buy that I was like, what is that? Anyway, that
Yes.
was a really long,
No,
long answer.
no, I loved it. Thank you.
And you know, there's a lot of grant and publishing and presenting opportunities right now. There's a lot of funding opportunities. These are big issues. So finding grant opportunities, it's the same thing where you're not going to find things like, I want money to do restorative justice in the community. Kind of have to figure out how they're talking about it and what their mission is. And then you find that terminology to help you connect to those, whether a student, an independent researcher, or a person in the community that says, you know, I want to start a nonprofit or work for a nonprofit that's connected to this issue.
Yep, wonderful. Thank you so much, Stacy. Great. So I'm going to go ahead and close the session out. Just a few more notes here. So a few weeks ago, it was National and International Lead Poisoning Prevention Week. So you will find more information on our resources page on our website. Also, the NSU Alvin Sherman Library is one of our partners in promoting this web series and virtual exhibit. If you live or work in Broward County, you can apply for an Alvin Sherman Library card. It's free and you will have access to many resources and get notified about events and programs like this one. And again, a big thank you to all of you for attending, for sticking around here a couple minutes after the time. A special thank you to our guest speakers, NaTisha and Stacy, as well as the committee members who help organize the event and the entire web series. And just make sure you visit lib.nova.edu/lead to visit the digital exhibit, watch recordings of past events, and access resources on the topics of lead poisoning, environmental health, and justice. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Daisy.